Like this?
Oh.
Okay. But can people in the room hear us loudly?
We're streaming in 1 second. They will hear your voice, but the streaming is okay.
Right, okay.
Okay, time to start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this side event on energy storage systems. From the report from yesterday from the IEA, we know that energy storage is a key technology for clean energy, but it's not on track, so we have to improve. This event is organized by ISCAN, International Smart Grid Action Network. It's a collaboration with 21st Century Power Partnership, and both are multilateral CEM initiatives. And ISCAN, just in one sentence, support high-level government attention action for smarter, cleaner electricity grids around the world. So it's all about clean energy. I'm Magnus Olofsson, and I work with ISCAN on behalf of Energimyndigheten, the Swedish Energy Agency. And ISCAN has a set of tools, and one such tool is to make case books for knowledge exchange. And here is one latest example on consumer engagement and empowerment. And the aim is actually to collect your knowledge and expertise to guide us in making the next case book that will be on energy storage systems. So the idea here is to present some examples of important energy storage technologies for clean energy and smart grid, and ask you and ask the panel and the speakers what to put into the next casebook. So that's actually the aim to be here. And we have a very experienced lineup. Oh, okay, not working for me at least. Next slide, please, if possible. We have an experienced lineup with the speakers and the panel, and of course all of you sitting here as well. So I'm very much excited to take part of your inputs during this hour. But we have a very short time frame to keep here, so I won't say much more than that, and I would like to introduce you, Ms. Helen Clarkson. And you are the CEO of the Climate Group, which is a non-profit organization that works internationally with businesses and subnational governments to accelerate climate action. So, most welcome, Helen.
Thank you.
Moderating.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Clarkson. I'm Chief Exec of the Climate Group. It's my job to keep to this timetable. So we've got to really stick to it. There'll be bells ringing telling us when to move on. Don't be alarmed by that, but speak quicker. So I won't take any more time before introducing the first item on our agenda, Dr. Lawrence Jones, who's going to set the scene for us and give us the importance of storage in facilitating power systems. I hand you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good. So forgive me if I seem to be falling asleep. I landed 2 hours ago from Washington. So Magnus had me do this, so if I fall asleep, that's his fault. In the interest of time, get my presentation up. What I'm going to do is basically set the scene from two perspectives, share some thoughts on storage from the US perspective, but then have a few slides to kind of provoke our thinking around this whole topic. Still waiting for the slide to show up. While it comes up, I'm jet lagged. The machine is jet lagged, so there we go. Everyone is jet lagged. But basically, let me just skip two of the slides by saying who am I? Lawrence Jones with Edison Electric Institute. What we do, we're an organization that basically works with utilities around the world and in the U.S. mainly investor-owned utilities working on everything from policy to business models, the evolution of the grid. And there are the slides, so go there. So let's begin. What if energy storage, as it exists today, existed 10, 20, or 50 years ago? How would the grid look today if energy storage technology that we have today existed 10 years ago? And I bring this up because as we talk about storage around the world, one of the things people need to think about is that it is going to transform how power grids are going to evolve. But like Descartes said, to arrive at the truth, sometimes you have to get rid of your old assumptions. So as engineers, how many people are engineers? Beautiful. My first fully engineer audience. Obviously, most times it's policymakers, but this time it's engineers. So we got to change our assumptions about the world. We have to change our assumptions about how we run the grid, right? So I already said who EI is, what we do around the world. I can skip that. So storage is going to shift the paradigm of power grids around the world. And what Thomas Kuhn said is shifting paradigms is not easy. And one of the challenges we face as engineers, as power system experts, is that we're used to thinking of the world in terms of having certain sets of generation sources existing, certain sets of distributed energy resources. But now we have this thing coming called storage, which means the way we run the grid, the operational aspect of the grid is going to change. The question is, are we ready for the change? And as we look at bringing more renewables online, this whole idea of variability and uncertainty, what does all of that mean in terms of how you run the grid? And why now? I mean, we've been storing energy in batteries for decades. So why now all this interest? And you can look at this from the grid side. You can also look at it from the market side. And we'll talk about it in the panel later on this morning on the policy drives. But just look on the grid side. You have everything from distributed energy resources. You have high volumes of renewables coming online. The modernization of the grid, looking at resiliency. These are things that are making us now look at storage from a different standpoint. But if you step back a little bit and think of the world at night, you still have billions of people around the world who don't have access to electricity. You can see this clearly, but basically, most parts of Africa, parts of Latin America still need access to electricity. What is energy storage going to do for those parts of the world? Because the issue is it enough to use energy storage on the distribution side if we're going to scale it up? Or do we need grid scale energy storage to scale up energy storage where it becomes not just cost effective, but where it also begins to have an impact on how we operate the system? So what are some of the barriers we're seeing around the world? We're seeing some of the issue of cost, technical performance. But I think the real area where you see a lot of barriers is on the regulatory side, right? How do you classify storage? Every time you talk about, when I talk to regulators around the world, the conversation around storage is like, well, storage is something, it's a generation resource. Well, if that's the case, we've had capacitor banks for decades, and they also store energy. So why just see battery as an energy storage device when you can see a capacitor bank or even an inductor as an energy storage device? Who gets to own storage? That's going to be very fundamental in terms of how we embrace and use this technology and how it affects operation and interconnection of grids around the world. But there is no one size fits all. And one of the things we do at EEI when we talk with utilities all over the world, everyone has a different approach. And so as Magnus talks about his case studies that ISCON is going to do, there's going to be so many different approaches. There is no one size fits all. And my concern always when it comes to these things is we're looking for the silver bullet. Let's take what happens in Sweden and apply it in South Africa, or take what happens in Japan and apply it in the US. It doesn't work that way. Everything has to be adapted to the local conditions, even when it comes to technology adoption and deployment. So storage has many uses, as we all know. Everything from on the generation, transmission side, all the way down to behind the customer. And so the conversation today mostly will be about grid-based energy storage, but even there are different approaches to how you go about deploying it. And the real challenge for us is to understand which part of this value chain energy storage is going to have an impact from an operational standpoint. What's driving storage today? In the US, for example, a lot of the large grid-scale storage is being deployed by utilities for various reasons. And we'll talk about some of those reasons in the presentations you will hear later on this morning. But you see that almost 90% of the storage being deployed in the US are being deployed by the utilities, both large distribution utilities, but also transmission companies. Here's an example of energy projects in the US, energy storage projects in the US, and you can see it's all across the country. What's interesting is that there are different markets within the US, which means there are different abilities to deploy storage. In California, for example, they have one approach which is based on investment that will defer investment in new technology or new transmission lines and distribution lines. On the East Coast, where you have markets, PJM and ERCOT, PGEM, for example, they're deploying storage for frequency response. In some cases, you're deploying storage for resiliency. So the question is, from a value perspective, what's the value, the use case that's being used for making the investment in storage? So we have a whole bunch of policies, and we'll have a panel discussion on policies. In the US, you have policies that are both at the federal level, at the state level, within the communities. So all of this is creating what I always say, the complexity around energy storage is because you just have so many different policy frameworks. And the question is, how do we understand these different policy frameworks, not just from the technology side, but even from the regulatory and policy side? If we leave the US and go to Australia, very interesting what's happening in Australia. In South Australia, when you have a high penetration of renewables, you've seen storage play a very important role. Everyone has heard of the Tesla battery. Now, the interesting thing, I made a few calls this morning, or yesterday morning, to my friends in Australia, and nobody can tell me how much Tesla is charging for the project. So they're deploying this, but they're very kind of secret on their information about the costs, which is very interesting. Nonetheless, we do see from a system perspective that they've seen the potential impact of that device on the wholesale market. But we need to understand how much is it costing. Because without understanding how much is it costing, it's going to be difficult to value or the benefit of the response we see from that storage device in Australia. So Australia is a market to watch when it comes to that. Another market is New Zealand. Very interesting in New Zealand. High penetration renewables, high amount of hydro. And when you talk to the grid operator there, there's very little interest to invest in storage on the distribution side. Because why? They already have high penetration of renewables in the system. So in that context, a lot of the investments is being seen coming on the transmission side to be able to manage the grid. So there's just a report that PEI put out that looks at the different steps in terms of storage. I will end by basically challenging the conversation this morning to go back to what I started when I said, what if storage existed 10, 15, 20 years ago? How would we have designed the network? How would we have designed the grid? That same thinking should be what we think about when we start designing case studies for this ISCAN report. We should not design case studies based on the old way of thinking. We should start thinking about how will the grid look in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So if you have high penetration of renewables, means you have less inertia on your system, means that perhaps you don't need frequency anymore. Why do you even measure frequency? Maybe frequency is something you don't need. Why are we measuring voltage? I don't know. But I think we need to provoke our thinking around what should be the metrics we use as we integrate storage onto our system. And I think I will stop there. And hopefully we have enough to start the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So an audience full of engineers, but my degree was in philosophy, and so I'm really happy to start the day with Descartes and Kuhn now. That's great. Our next presentation, I can't promise you more philosophy, but who knows, is Luciano Martini, who's going to talk to us about short-term energy storage. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope my presentation will also show up. I'm Luciano Martini from RSC in Italy, and we do care about storage. We pay attention to how storage can play a role as a grid service provider. And we also are very much interested, Magnus, to have some contribution to the casebook from the Italian side. Talking about Italy, I would like to mention that today I'm just speaking on behalf of our colleagues from Enel. Enel is an Italian DSO, is worldwide actually, is present in South America, is present in Europe in different places. I should say that it's quite innovative DSO. They start already long ago about dealing with the system operation supported by storage. And I think they received already a nice award from ISCAN in 2015 because of this project, Grid for You. Was a very large project that ended in Europe a couple of years ago with 6 very important distribution system operators involved in the project. Each of them has an important demo in their own respective country, and the Italian demo was actually exactly on storage. They were using storage to see how they can increase the hosting capacity of the grid. This was a very successful experimental activity that was fully successful in the sense that the storage was actually providing support and increasing the hosting capacity in that area. This is an area, it's still an urban area, but low densely populated area, you can say. We have a significant amount of PV, renewable, but especially PV in the network, and some part of the day you have a low consumption. So you have some voltage violation, and we were looking at the storage as a most effective solution to provide support to voltage violation and avoiding that. This is the past. RSC actually was involved and was supporting Enel in this kind of experimental activity. And what is important that to make it easy, we also rely on a fully automated system where you have a communication between the secondary substation and the primary substation, and they have a real-time monitoring on the status of the feeder where the storage has been installed. This is what is happening now. I'm sorry, but I realize that part of the slide is in Italian, but nevertheless, this is like a prolongation of grid for you. In some sense, this new project is using the same asset. The storage that was installed for grid for you is now used in a broader sense, because it's not just hosting capacity, but also studying what reactive and active power can be provided by a storage system and helping the grid to be more sustainable. And again, they use the same installation. There are comparisons with other demo in different parts of Europe. And this is in a framework that I think is also very relevant to us. TSO-DSO interaction is becoming more and more important. And you know that DSO can provide support to the transmission network. This is exactly the scope of the Italian demo in this, let's say, second phase, where the same storage system has been provided for enhanced frequency response. And this is now a project that started maybe 7 months ago, so it's still in like at the very early stage. And the system, maybe I didn't mention before, is a 1 megavolt ampere, 1 megawatt hour battery, electrochemical batteries. And there is an important side of this storage system that on the distribution level. Being on the distribution level is always exchanging power with the transmission level. This is exactly the scope of the demo. I think any people could say much more about their strategy. I think it's important to see that DSO are open to this innovation. They see a benefit, and something that I could say just for reflection and for further discussion during the panel is that maybe one storage system doesn't have a positive business case if it's just for one purpose or one special utilization. But if a storage system can be used for several of these services of the grid, that could be the key of success. So this is my message from Italy, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to ask you a question. We've actually got time to spare this time, so we've got 2 minutes. Let's have one question for you, and then
Yeah, Karin Widgren, I'm the chair of ISCAN, but not so well informed about this project. I have a question for you about, from your presentation, it looks like the storage facility is very much integrated in the operation of the network. And for you are European, you know that in Europe we are, as we speak, the European legislators are working on the legislation saying that we don't want DSO to own storage. So I would have your reflection on that.
Yeah, it's a real installation. There are something like 20 feeder under this substation, and they have a real customer, about 3,500 customers. So this has been assessed by the regulator in Italy, and they got a special way of running the system under this condition. So this has been dealt. It's a kind of pilot. I think Enel has a similar one in another part of Italy, in south of Italy. And these are really under the eye of the regulator, just to see if this is viable and which are the final benefits for the customer. That is also part of the role. So I think this is very relevant. If it's successful also this second phase, I think that could open for storage application much broadly. That is our idea. Thank you, Karin.
great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I should have said, Luciana is also the vice chair of this council, so I'm sure you're very
That's my
involved in
pleasure.
this. Yeah, great, thank you. Now I'd like to welcome Richard Luke, who's a stipendiary lecturer in engineering at Oxford University, and his research interests are beyond battery, electrical energy storage, and the integration of renewable electrical energy into chemical production processes and semi-islanded networks.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
That is impressive. Take us away.
So, just to present, this is work from myself and Professor René Benares Alcantara. So, we're not looking then at batteries, but instead sort of beyond that, so how we could use sort of chemicals. So, I'm really going to look at then, initially, the importance of long-term storage, why chemical then is the best to meet this, which chemicals we should be looking at, and then the regulatory developments that we really need for this to be the case. So, as Lawrence has said, if we look at sort of the overall system, here I'm going to look at the UK energy system. If we get a good grasp of the numbers, in reality most of our storage is still really based around fossil fuels. Okay? So yes, we've got a lot of talk about batteries and that's doing a lot for our frequency response, but at the moment everything's really sort of stuff that's sat by sort of a power station. But at the moment in the UK then we've already cut out coal. So we're losing some of the flexibility in this system, sort of balancing on a longer term storage. And yes, pumped hydro is the gold standard for energy storage, but at the moment it's still small relative. It's still 3 orders of magnitude. We're storing in gas grids, really, instead. So, in terms then the current storage technologies that are available to us, so what's the mix of storage technologies that we want? In reality then, this sort of dashed line is then sort of where we're operating at the moment in terms of the balancing that we need in most countries. We can sort of get by with batteries. But then as we're sort of moving with our renewable penetration, that's really going to increase. So we're going to need sort of longer term storage, sort of pumped hydro. We've actually then done a little bit of work quantifying sort of this need, as well as then the value attained to sort of which different storage technologies. So, if we then go one step further and just look at, okay, we've been told briefly, yes, we're going to integrate potentially electrifying heat and transport. I say this with caution then, we really have to be careful because at the moment we're having issues managing this fluctuation in electricity. If we're integrating these other two, we've got to be careful rather than just passing the buck to electricity. So, electrifying chemical production then can do multiple things. So you've got multiple revenue streams, which mitigates your risk. You can then sort of operate in multiple sectors, so heating, selling it as a commodity, heat, also then transport fuel potentially, as well as sort of feedstock to other industry. This is then also decarbonising the production process, so AIM sort of helps us get to our CO2 emission reductions, as well as offering this long-term storage. So, but there are multiple chemicals then that could actually do this. So which chemicals should we be looking at? So if we look at sort of then, including the carbon intensity, the density really then in terms of mass and volume, then of potential options. In reality, sort of we're way away from sort of the gasoline that we've been using to date, but sort of you have many just sort of sitting around, carbon being sort of a precursor for coal then, that can compete with what we're using at the moment in terms of natural gas. So here I'm going to look then at hydrogen and ammonia. I must note if you want to have a look at power to gas, so natural gas and methanol, there is decent literature out there, in the interest of time. A case study of hydrogen then. This is really sort of the enabling technology that for all chemicals. So instead of getting your hydrogen then from water via electrolysis, then would facilitate all of these. But in and of its own right, it's got many projects then looking at integrating it into gas networks so that you could then decarbonise heat, and it could also be reintroduced into your electricity network using standard fuel cells that already operate. In terms of the technology readiness, it's really sort of up there at the top, but needs sort of significant scale up at the moment. Ammonia being the other one, it accounts currently on its own for 1.3% of global CO2 emissions. It's essential for sort of fertiliser production, so you have a massive market there already, and we know how to handle it. The issue being it's doubly dependent on fossil fuels. One, for its feedstock, and also two, then, for the energy that's required during the process. At the moment, there's a lot of interest in this in particular. However, it is sort of slightly less scaled up, so the big projects that are likely to come in are going to be in sort of the 2020s. If you do have further questions, this is one project that I'm currently sort of working on with Siemens and Cardiff University, so please do ask me afterwards if you have any issues. With respect to then the technical and regulatory developments, technically many of these are relatively mature. Yes, there are improvements that can be made, but most of the barriers are really on the regulatory side. So there should be sort of incentives to sort of recognise here that sort of the green potential of these technologies and sort of the multifaceted way that they can operate in many sectors. Hydrogen content in networks is limited to a degree by the amount of hydrogen sort of that you can stick in due to the piping, but in many sort of developed countries that isn't the problem. The problem is really, as you can see sort of here, sort of the regulation with regards to that, UK being particularly bad. And this would have significant impact then. Last but not least, as has been noted already by Lawrence, sort of a clarification then of the regulations with regards to energy storage, so that you don't double penalise it both as sort of a taker of energy and a supplier would be excellent. So to conclude, then electricity networks will become increasingly dependent on sort of long-term storage as renewable penetration increases. Chemical storage of these really stands out then. Many chemicals can fit this bill, and that's yet to be decided, but in reality we should electrify most to meet our carbon dioxide targets anyway. And this could then have multiple benefits, but regulation is needed to be changed in order to incentivise this. I'd just like to thank sort of some funding, but if you have any questions, I'd like to hand that over.
Great. We can take a quick question. Sorry? Very good. Anyone got a quick question? Yes.
Marianne from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I really liked your first chart where you're showing the different lifetimes of the storage, what they can give you. We've been recently looking with our utilities of what is required in terms of storage in the future, and what everybody's saying is long term, right? Because it's about getting beyond the seasonal. Do you see any other storage options apart from the chemical one that you mentioned? So anything else that sits on the very top right of that chart?
I mean, it's hypothesised to use sort of hydro at that length, but in reality, at the moment, even if you have that asset, it's only really used for short-term operating reserve, so sort of 4-hour operating. For me, at the moment, no. The only other way would really be sort of relying on other flexibility methods. So in reality, it's less on sort of the technical side, but what's more economical. And if you're integrating CCS with a peaker plant potentially, that's something that should also be considered. Sorry for not giving you the silver bullet then.
No, sorry I haven't saved the planet with my answer. Great, thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome Joachim Lindberg, who's the CTO for Sustainable Innovation in Sweden, and likes innovative thinking and the next Internet of Things for creating capacity wealth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll see if my slides are coming up as
There
well.
you go.
I'm Joachim Lindberg, work at a company called Sustainable Innovation with just 11 people. And we're sort of on the other end. We're down there. We try to change who's doing what in the network. And based on the fact that there's buying very much things, we are connecting various devices. I mean, there's weekly shops out for doing your own smart things, and everybody has a sort of remote control devices at home, more or less. People are doing very fun things with Wi-Fi connected radiators. One of those is perhaps 1 kilowatt. That's a 2 kilowatt Wi-Fi connected thing with the app together. So it's very easy for it to suddenly, I'll go for the electricity price. It's cheap. And 100,000 of those in Stockholm turns on at 1 p.m. because it's the same software, it's the same default settings. And for Myre Sjuhus, who builds villas, they build the same heat pump, they have the same configuration, the same default values, the same passwords. I mean, so they will take decisions that is internet accuracy on hour, because the price change every hour. So you will have him flipping 100,000 heat pumps, 2, 3, 4 kilowatts each, every hour, taking a decision. Is it cheap or is it not cheap? So we applied to the energy department, and we had a very interesting project where we put out 500 heat pumps in a rural network. So it's 14,000 customers north of Uppsala, Sweden. And we started to get these out at customer sites. So the thing for the customer is that they get energy efficiency and a smart app. That's the upside for the customer. So they do an energy efficient saving, they have an app to the house, they could schedule when they are away and so on. And they have and they think that that's very nice, it's a free service. And by that we could change and turn these heaters on and off. So it's more or less that the DSO could use this, but it could also be a balancing power, or it's a non-regulated balancing blackmailing, because if we turn them off, we remove energy that is not sold on the energy market. We're deregulated in Sweden. So if the DSO dispatch a peak shaving thing, the wholesale company doesn't get the balance. So we need, in Sweden now we have very problematic, is the aggregator needing to have a balanced responsibility together with the wholesale company, and that gets very complex, and that's what we have a finger on in this project. But is it really a potential then? Well, for the first it's very easy. What we do is that we go into a heat pump, it has an outside temperature, which is the control system. If you have an outside temperature, you have a certain temperature on the water-based heating. We are only on water-based heating because that's where we have the inertia. We have a storage in the house. So we can shut down the house for an hour, 2 hours, depending on the insulations. So we have inside sensors verifying how the house is changing. And we never go down more than 1 degree. So nobody notice anything. Very easy installation. And in fact, during this spring, we had on the 20th of February and the 30th, 1st of March. So 24 hours on a monthly shift, where the DSO's power tariff towards the regional grid flips over a month, which meaning 2 high hours, and the mean value of that is the peak cost. So that hour, they got about their 60 abonnerad effect, or the subscription for power, or 60 megawatts. And they raised about with a half. So that hour costed them 1,320 euros. That hour with that half. So power is expensive for a DSO. That peak power for 1 hour was very expensive. And if you look at this, this is the mathematical model we have tried to verify. We go a few times before, and then we go after the actual measurement of the grid, what actually happened. So we don't really know what happened. We were there steering, so this is probably, if we didn't steer, this would have happened with quite good significance. We haven't measured everything, but it's quite good. In best case, we would be on 3.3 kilowatt hours for an hour. 3,300, so 3.3 megawatt hours. And in worst case, 700. So with quite good accuracy, we can say that with 250 houses in Sweden, we unleash 1 megawatt of flexibility. We have 1,500,000 water-based, electricity-feeded houses. The heat pump, direct electricity, water-based heat, air to water, but it's a water-based heating system, and it has electricity as the main source in some kind. That would give us somewhere about 6 gigawatts of flexible power. And we have discussing on 5 million electric cars in Sweden doing a peak when they come home and charging. And that's somewhere between 3.8 gigawatts. So do we have a flexibility problem? No. We have already installed the energy storage in the houses. We just need to control it. On the other side of the electricity meter, outreach of DSOs, outreach of any TSO, but it could be joined almost on every market. But it's a company doing a thing. And that could be wall sockets, it could be dishwashers or whatever. Any device active on the grid with internet connection and IoT devices. If you have a lot of them, they will affect you. If Elon Musk says, oh, we do it together, we charge all Teslas at 6 p.m. around the world, why not? could be a problem. So, that was me, and we are really unleashing a very interesting thing. And I would recommend the ISCAN session on room 2 after here, where we talk about the regulations, because this is very problematic out of the regulation part. Who to own this? Can the DSO subsidize it, own it, or must it be a wholesale company doing it, or free companies that don't have any regulations? So it could be very problematic on who to dispatch this. They can even blackmail wholesale companies, shifting the balance around the country. Oh, we just use the energy over there and we don't use it over there, and suddenly have an imbalance between different wholesale companies. And it's not illegal, just about not very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good, yes, thank you. I feel like we're getting the next plot, the next season of The Bridge there somehow worked out.
Yeah, really.
Blackmailing.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite the panel to join me now. You've already met Dr. Lawrence Jones from Edison Electric Institute. I'm also going to invite Bo Hasselbank, Senior Director for Power Plant Products at Vestas, another Bo Normark, Thematic Leader for Smart Grids, Electric Storage at EIT Inno Energy, and Dr. Jonas Peterson, the Head of Section Power Technology at Vattenfall R&D. So come and take your seats. Let me throw in an advert. Give you 20 seconds. Negotiation. Right. Great. So this panel, as you know, the ambition of this session is to prepare the next ISCAN case study book. So what I'd like to do is get each of our panelists to introduce themselves, give us one example, one of your favourite examples or case studies, talk us through it, and then we'll go straight to the audience because I sense there's some burning energy for questions. From the audience we'd like questions, but also your examples of things that you'd like to throw into the casebook. So let's start here and take it away.
Okay.
The microphones are for streaming, they don't broadcast, so you have to...
Yeah. Very interesting session this. I will say something about what we are doing at my company, and we have put up a lot of many battery parks in Europe. One example is Pennick Mod in Wales, where it is of 22 megawatt, and there we do enhanced frequency control, which is really fast primary frequency control. And the primary frequency control is the first thing that happens in Europe, I would like to say. Until now, we don't do so many other things, but really it is, you can do so many things with batteries, and I like really to see a development of the requirements, the regulatory frames in the future, so that we can do all the possible things with batteries. Some says that you can do 13 beneficial things for the grid with a battery, but today we don't have the regulatory frame to do all these things. So this technique will really change the mindset, as Lauren said here. I believe that we will still need frequency and voltage, since we still have synchronous machines that likes very much voltage and frequency. But when we have disconnected the last synchronous machine, then we can have a very free frequency and voltage. But so now, if we now add all this flexibility in loads, e-mobility, batteries at several voltage levels, load shift, the thermal inertia that Joachim talked about, this will be a fantastic toolbox for the future power system stability. And I certainly believe that we will need less inertia in the future, because we will have so fast response and so fast communication. So I think we will stick to less inertia in the future at some point.
Great.
Thank you. My name is Bo Hesselbeck. Let's say I'm coming from Vestas, and we built wind turbines. We put up wind turbines in, I think now we are about 76 countries in the world. And of course we see a lot of of issues, let's say around the world, when we put up turbines in different regions where they also talk about, let's say, how to solve the future, let's say, amount of renewables in the power system. I would say we haven't seen that many challenges around the world yet. It will come, but right now it's mainly on demo projects. We have had a project running here in Denmark since 2012, I think, delivering frequency support for the Danish system operator together with a turbine. We are now building in Australia a larger project combining both wind, solar and energy storage to supply everything from congestion to, let's say, time shifting. So my personal challenge is the same as here. Regulation, we see many different types of regulation around the world, different types of grid codes. And for us, it's a nuisance to have to adapt to the many different approaches. I would believe the more standardized we can get the rules, the regulations, the more industrialized we can also get the solutions, so thereby reducing the cost of implementing that for the future.
Great, thank you.
You can go first.
Okay, so my name is Bo Normark. I am thematic leader in InnoEnergy for storage and smart grids. InnoEnergy is actually it's a company, European company, partly owned by the European Commission and partly owned by industry. And we are working promoting, innovation in the sustainable area. In the storage area, which are responsible, we have like 20 different companies and projects engaged, covering supercapacitors, lithium batteries, and hydrogen storage, these three. Mainly, we have a few smaller others also. What I would like to highlight a couple of things and in terms of best practice. One thing is that no one has mentioned here today that we talk about how you can reduce and manipulate whatever the demand, but what we don't talk so much about is that the grid capacity will be determined by the peak production, not by the peak consumption. So we need to handle, and for instance, we looked at a study of Swedish system today. We have 40 gigawatt in installed production, and we have 150 terawatt hours in consumption. We are looking at the future system with 60 to 70 gigawatt and same energy consumption. So surely, I mean, that's where the problem is coming. How can we manage this excessive, I would say, production? But then coming back on the demand side again, we have made a lot of studies, and I do share the view that we have so many options there, including thermal, electric, and I don't see why we would have a problem if we get things right in the regulatory and business models. One example, we made a study based on actual data from a large number of buildings, apartment buildings in Sweden, where we show that by installing a battery with just 1 kilowatt hour per apartment, we could shave the peak by 40%. And by installing 3 kilowatt hours per apartment, we could shave the peak by 80%. So peak shaving is frankly quite simple if you want to do it. Then finally, I would address one thing, and that is the merger, of course, between the transport and power sector, because we talk about electric vehicles, we talk about charging, and again here, if you look at the potential for using these mobile batteries, because remember, as we use cars today, they are parked 96% of the time. And one example only that is one of my favorite. If you are interested in using to own a stationary storage today, buy an electric car and put it in the garage, and not you, because that's the cheapest battery you can buy. Secondly, if you are considering to buy an electric car, and some of them they have different sizes of batteries, choose the biggest battery, because the incremental cost for buying additional battery capacity in the car is today about $100 per kilowatt hour. That's cheap.
Great, thank you.
So what I just want to bring two things up. So in terms of case studies, I think, we've heard everyone on this panel said regulatory barriers. And what I find fascinating is that We as engineers, most of us, and philosophers, you in this case, we talk about the regulatory model, but there's no regulatory experiment. So I've reached a point in my career where I'm, at EI, I work with utilities all over the world, and people talk about regulation and policy. And my point is, if you know the regulation is bad, if you think it's the barrier, why not fix it? So my recommendation is, of a case study is, why not look for case studies where you do regulatory experiments? Because we spend a lot of time saying the regulation is a barrier, the regulation is wrong. Well, so, Jonas, Boo, Lawrence, let's get together and let's imagine what the regulation should be and then go and present it to the policymakers. What we do as an industry is we sit back as engineers, have policymakers design something that don't think of all the technical aspects of it, and then we're forced to fix it. So I think in terms of case studies, we should be looking for case studies that are really regulatory case studies where we design what the regulation should look like, as opposed to the reverse. So that's one of the things I would say. The other point is in terms of utilities, the issue came up in terms of, I think you said it, Joachim, you said, who should do this? Should the DSO do it or should someone else do it? I think there's room for everybody. I think the mistake we're making in Europe right now is already beginning by saying, well, the DSOs cannot do this, or the TSOs cannot do this. If we look at what caused renewable energy to scale up, it wasn't because of rooftop PV. It was because of large-scale investments by the large utilities who have the volume and who have the capacity to invest. I think it would be a mistake in Europe, and elsewhere in the world, if the regulation limits the DSOs and the TSOs from participating in storage, because they're the ones who have scale. We saw the situation in the UK when UK Power Network went out and did a solicitation for storage projects or storage providers. They didn't get the response from the market. So they believe that there's all these market participants out there who will come and invest in storage is not 100% true. So I think we should open it up, don't have barriers, and just put in the right regulatory mechanisms and the market manipulation methods to make sure that the DSOs and the TSOs do not exercise market power, but still let them have the ability to own and operate storage. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to scale up.
Thank you. So now over to the audience. Let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions and comments and then come back to the panel rather than do one-to-one. So who's got something they would like to ask or comment on? Everyone's over. Yes, let's go.
Maybe one question about the aging of the battery system. Battery systems are still rather expensive, and as all the other assets are supposed to be in service for 20 or 30 years. We were very much concerned about very deep discharge, maybe affecting the lifetime of the battery. Can you say anything about experiment taking care of a fast response if it's also affecting the lifetime of battery webinar?
Great, thank you. Be thinking of your questions, maybe. Oh, yeah, let's have one more question now and then come.
So what is being done to help consumers participate in the market? So what incentives are they given to give up control of their batteries to someone who can actually maximise their potential? Great,
thank you. So let's go along, take either or both.
I think Bo is the most chemical.
Well, I'm not the most chemical, but I can say that on this account, that's one of the reasons that we are quite interested in supercapacitors. Combining supercapacitors and lithium batteries appears today to be a quite good combination.
Hybrid system.
Hybrid system, yeah.
And to your question here, there is certainly certain tariffs in some European countries that then influence the demand for customers to have a battery. We can see that very clear in Germany, where it is a really good idea to do some peak shaving to reduce your peaks when you have a battery. So there it has started in Germany very much to reduce the peak, but you mean that to help battery owners to use their batteries? I don't know if there is so many aggregators today that does that. In
10
Europe.
minutes or the 5 minutes? I don't know.
Can I just make a comment on the issue
Yeah.
of enabling the customer? I think it's great to do that, but let's remember what happened in 50 hertz. When you have a lot of these devices on the distribution side behind the meter, and the utilities have no visibility, weird things can happen on the network. So as much as we want more and more engagement from the customers, which is great, we should also make sure that the visibility at the control room is also there, because we don't want a situation where you have all these storage devices coming off the system or coming on the system with lack of visibility. It creates operational challenges. We saw it in Germany with all those distributed energy resources, and we saw what happened with the frequency when all of a sudden a solar cloud came and then you had these strange phenomena. So I think we need to be very pragmatic about enabling customers, but also making sure that the visibility is given to the utilities to operate the grid.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, comments? I had one about, I don't know how you all felt when Elon Musk and South Australia seemed to do a deal by tweet. Is that the sort of paradigm shift and challenge to regulation you're thinking? How do you think that's going to play out? And I know you'd added, say, Powerwall versus global grid debate. That's where do you think that's going in the next few years, and how's that going to play out? We're talking about paradigm shifts here.
I can mention, let's say, I started my career in the Danish transmission system operator when there was 700 megawatts in the Danish wind in the Danish system. Today there's 5 gigawatts. And at that time we knew we had to do something, and we said, okay, storage, that's too expensive, so we built grid. But I would say that's still a cost-benefit question. Let's say the Danish system was easy because we could just make good connections to Norway, and they had storage, so we solved our problem.
Yeah.
But I would say that's very much, let's say, choosing the right tools in the different systems. I have heard about the Chinese idea about building a global transmission grid. I don't, let's say, seen from a balancing point of view, it's a great idea. I might not trust that the economics fit together or the political let's say, decision power is there to do that, but that's a different question.
We can take that separate, but I think economics are there. It's difficult though with security. And then I'll put one thing, Lawrence, you said a good thing here. Why should we deny DSO stone storage? Because one of the things we see, and you also said one thing is, what if we build the grid from scratch today? And one of the things you can see that if you consistently, for instance, apply storage, everyone has storage, so you can survive, for instance, 6 hours. You can build a quite simple grid.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of paradigm we should look for.
So just on the point of Mr. Musk, I think the challenge we have with this issue is, Jonas mentioned aggregators. If you have 200 megawatts of aggregated demand or aggregated storage, right, shouldn't you be treated like a generator? Because the issue here is a lot of these new entrants who are coming don't want to be subjected to any regulation, but they're behaving like a utility.
Yeah.
So
They're
if
from Silicon Valley,
so if I own 500 megawatts of distributed resources that I get from the consumer, my impact on the grid is just like having a large centralized power plant. That power plant is treated differently than the aggregator. That is not fair. So I think Mr. Musk and others can come and play, but let's make sure we all play on the same, the same playing field. Not have one rules for them and one rules for the generators and one rules for the TSOs.
Right.
But I think we should admit that this industry needs a kick in the back, I think.
Yeah. But remember, Boog, it's good to kick in the back, but the lights should never go off.
Yeah.
Today, when the lights go off, the regulators will not call Elon Musk. The regulators will call Vattenfall.